You guys probably have heard the news by now, but if you're living underneath a rock, Valve has finally released SteamOS 3.7, almost essentially officializing SteamOS to be enabled on a handful of other devices, with a few stipulations. First one mainly being it has to be running an AMD processor, but they do mention that you can download it on other devices as sort of testing purposes. It's very unclear where the line is sort of drawn, but for best results essentially, you want an AMD processor, which includes pretty much every single PC handheld, aside a few budget handhelds from Ionia, which I technically think they don't even sell anymore, and most notably the MSI Claw. But that device isn't nearly as popular as many other solutions like the Ally and the Legion Goes of the world, so I doubt that will affect many people, but it's just fascinating to see this sort of official support for SteamOS on these other devices. Because for a while now, you have been able to install SteamOS onto them, but it's through less official means, there wasn't a great way to do it, and required a level of technical and software knowledge that the average consumer might not necessarily have without following a tutorial. But they have recently updated their recovery images to install SteamOS on their devices, and they now have options for ISOs for other handhelds, which is fantastic, and it truly does mean that SteamOS is now available for everybody, something that Valve has been working towards ever since the Steam Deck originally released back in, I believe, February or March of 2022. So this is a very momentous occasion for the PC handheld community because SteamOS has been such an amazing operating system for many PC handhelds. It turned a PC handheld from being garbage to actually being very good, that being the Lenovo Legion Go S. That device was bad, and I'll be honest, it was quite bad in terms of a Windows handheld. Price, value, performance, across the board, it was terrible. For, at least at the time pricing wise, for an extra $70, you got an Ally X, which drastically outperformed it by a ridiculous margin. And it was, in some cases, worse than the Steam Deck, which was almost half the cost of a Legion Go S, which wasn't great. But now with the official release of the Legion Go S with SteamOS coming in a much cheaper variety at $500, that device went from being a pretty bad value and horrible performance to being a pretty decent value, especially if you're hunting for something like the Steam Deck but you want a little bit more performance. Because in SteamOS, it does perform a lot better. I wouldn't say a lot better than the Steam Deck, but for itself, it is a lot better and on average does perform better than the Steam Deck. So buying that as an alternative option, honestly, for a lot of people, might make a lot of sense, especially if you're in the mood for a higher refresh rate display than what the Steam Deck OLED can provide, which maxes out at 90 Hz, and for the Legion Go S, caps out, I believe, 144, 120 Hz. Granted, it is 1080p and IPS, so it's not the most beautiful display out there like the Steam Deck OLEDs with its amazing OLED HDR display, but for most people, I believe, frankly, the 120 Hz IPS display found in the Legion Go S is going to be plenty okay for the vast majority of people. But having access to SteamOS for pretty much all PC handhelds with AMD processor now being a thing honestly changes the whole PC handheld space. It changes what devices people should buy. Devices that some consumers who would have bought a Steam Deck might choose to get something like an original Z1 non-extreme Ally, install official SteamOS onto it, and have a device that performs a little bit better than the Steam Deck while being almost half the cost in some cases. Because I've been able to find those Z1 non-extreme handhelds for anywhere between $250 to $350, which is cheaper than all models of Steam Deck now because they no longer sell that base 64 gig Steam Deck at $350. The cheapest official, not refurbished handheld you can get is at $400, which is the old 256 gig model Steam Deck. Another small prerequisite that realistically won't affect anybody unless you happen to be installing this on a full tower, which seems unlikely, is that you need to have an SSD, which is really easy to actually come by these days, and every single PC handheld comes with one by default. The only one that never came with an SSD by default was that original 64 gig Steam Deck, which technically used an embedded SD card on an M.2 substrate sort of connector piece that basically was essentially a micro SD card just on a PCB designed for an M.2 slot. So fundamentally, it wasn't an SSD by any means, which is hilarious considering that all the other models came with SSDs, and this stipulates it has to have an SSD, but clearly it doesn't if it worked on the original Steam Deck. Semantics aside, you need to have an SSD for this to work, which shouldn't be an issue because all PC handhelds by standard usually have an SSD inside of them. People who want a PC handheld but wanted the ease of use of something like the Steam Deck really didn't have very many choices. For a while there, it was the only choice to get a Steam Deck. Now there's things later on, there was Bazai in Halo OS, there were a few other options as years went on, and then we eventually got the announcement of the Legion Go S being an official SteamOS handheld, which was awesome. But it still left people with not very many options, and as PC handhelds developed and got more performant and just overall just better, the Steam Deck started to look a lot worse, and even with the Legion Go S not being a powerhouse of a handheld, it really left people who wanted the simplistic experience, the console-like day-to-day use of their handheld, to really not having very many choices in terms of if they wanted something more powerful. Now you can take a Z1 Extreme Ally and hawk SteamOS onto that thing and call it a day. You have the console-like experience of Steam Deck while having the amazing performance that is given to you by the Z1 Extreme. News is still fresh, so we can't say for certain how battery life is going to be, but I anticipate it being better because Windows just has a lot of background junk happening constantly. Whether that is by design or because Windows is bad, who's to say? But overall, Windows just has a lot more stuff happening in the background because there is a lot more things you're going to be doing usually. And SteamOS, it is specifically designed for gaming, so there really isn't a huge amount of background tasks happening. And with Linux being a lighter weight operating system in general, performance, of course, is going to be better, and battery life, therefore, should be better as well. In terms of power management, you now get to use the amazing built-in TDP adjuster in SteamOS, which is honestly fantastic. I would love to see the expansion of this into more desktop devices, though, because the way I see it is those little microcomputers with what essentially is a Z1 Extreme or the HX370 or whatever the heck it is, run fantastically, and I would love to see SteamOS come devices like that. I mean, they do run AMD processors, but it's not a Z chip or a custom AMD solution found like in the Steam Deck, so I'm not entirely sure how that would work, but assuming it just sort of works because it's an AMD processor and it runs an SSD, I don't see any reason why it wouldn't work, but it could be in that whole gray area of an uncertified device and whatnot, so it could either work completely normally, or it could be a little jank, but I would love to see greater degree of support for a desktop solution, not necessarily for the desktop mode, but for that sort of home console-like experience, but access to your Steam library. For a lot of people who have PC handhelds for the very first time, building that Steam library for the first time, getting something like one of those little bee's nest boxes or one of the many Intel Nook style devices out there would be a great way to have a home console at home while still being able to have your Steam Deck or your Ally with SteamOS on it to be for the on the go. And it allow you to have something at least sort of separate the two experiences. Yes, you can use a dock, but some people might not like that. And having a dedicated desktop sort of little cube of gaming for your TV or for when you're traveling and you set up at a hotel. Yes, you might want to use a dock, but having something you can leave behind or something you don't really need to touch a whole lot, something with more storage than what your Steam Deck could possibly have, would be amazing. And having a desktop solution would be honestly something I would very much be interested in. And definitely something I will be testing as we go further into this new era of SteamOS on everything. I would love to hear what you guys think about this though. Are you thinking about installing SteamOS on any of your handhelds? I would love to hear about this down below. Don't forget to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. All the other subscription garbage down below. And last but not least, have a wonderful day.